think one of the amazing things about a conference like this is that there will be, at times, situations in which a group of people will be sitting at a table who have never sat together and will never sit together after the conference is over. And right now, in this room, this situation is taking place. You can't hear me? Yeah. Okay, is that better? Can you hear me now? What I was saying was that we're now in a moment in which something extraordinary is happening, which is that a group of people are sitting at a table who have never sat together at a table and will never sit together, as far as I know. Maybe tonight they will. But I think this kind of constellation of people coming from different disciplines, different institutions, and being sort of assembled here together, I think it's a sort of I think it's an opportunity. It's certainly an event, and there's so much now on this table for us to talk about that it's hard to know where to begin. There's a part of me that's thinking, when I'm trying to figure out who is here, who are we at this table, I'm thinking one of the things who we might be is well, maybe as a kind of architectural academic. What might be being staged here is a kind of architectural academic family drama in which we have a homeless architectural historian. We have two architects in the academy who are telling the historian how much they need her in the studio, how much she can inform what happens in the studio. We have the dean, who is, I think, with more consternation than maybe he admits. Maybe you were enjoying the anxiety as a professor of classics, but as a dean, you don't want the faculty to be too anxious, and then the journalist who will have something to write about. So my question, one of the questions is, and perhaps it's a question primarily for Eve, but also for George and Wes, is why is architectural history so anxious? Or what is that? And what is that anxiety if our architects, as represented by George and Wes, seem to be very not only agreeable but kind of seeing architectural history as kind of a necessary part of the curriculum of architecture school. Why so homeless?
Well, actually, that is a purely institutional thing, and that at Harvard, for instance, architectural history started out in the School of Architecture, and then moved to the Department of Fine Arts, and then gradually was repatriated, I would say, in the School of Architecture, and so. This, it's not a paranoia that we're talking about. We're talking about an institutional or sort of institutional revisions that are going on.
It's a paranoia, too.
Well, it becomes paranoia. It is a paranoia, yeah. Okay. But it has been this sort of institutional thing, and it has also had to do with sort of the vagaries of architecture and the significance, I mean, the reason that the future of history in architecture, or the role of history, and it just comes up again and again. And I guess that for architects, it's a pedagogical issue. For architectural historians, it's a kind of existential issue. No, but and actually we are now discovering, and one of the things that came out of this special issue that I did in the journal was that architectural history is taught very differently in the context of the Department of Art History and Architecture, or departments of art history and architecture, from the way in which it's taught in architecture schools. So that there are different questions, there are different interests, there are different foci. It is becoming different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly I would say from my perspective that on the studio side is that it seems like history is in support, like everything, of the studio exercise and the experience that happens there. For the last 15 or 20 years after this kind of great interest in theory and criticism that was alluded to many times in the early 80s and early 90s. That technology has come to the fore and taken up so much of the attention in studio, and it is in a way a market economy. You know, what is interesting is what gets taught in a kind of a sort of feedback loop, and so we found ourselves now recognizing that the historical part of the equation, so to speak, again, we have to remember to embed the architectural experience in its larger context, which is temporal as well as spatial, obviously. The historical part of that has kind of dissipated away. And I expected in the conversation about history and the discipline to talk about the potential trouble a discipline could be in, because it's hard to imagine a discipline being constituted without a sense of its history, which is a thing that, in the same way that history always necessarily exists because, you know, the past exists, it's the consciousness of it that really kind of matters, whether that's operationalized or not, and that's what's kind of gone away now. And the worry that somebody like I would have, who's very interested in continuity and talks to, as you could tell from the slides in my presentation, you know, when I was a student, the canon and the modernists and everything were still daddies that you, by my time, wanted to maybe fight with, but you know, there was still an argument to be had. And so that was important because that gave my my work meaning. In the sense that that has kind of gone away and the thread might be lost. History is where the thread is maintained, perhaps. And so it becomes a huge issue now when technology has come to the fore and has nothing to say about history yet.
And I would agree with what Wes has said, but I would just add to it that and it's not a critique of Google. I mean, my younger friends have taught me how to do it myself. I Google more and more. So no offense to Googling, but there is the question of depth, as Timothy Hyde pointed out on the panel yesterday. And Google's great for synchronic dimension. Someone didn't show you synchrony and diachrony. Google's great for the synchronic dimension. It's not so great for the diachronic dimension. And so, as far as I can see, Google's not so great. So far, you know, it's an evolving technology too, but it's not so great for depth. So, as the movie maker said, television came along, but it didn't kill us. I'm saying the same thing about books. Google has come along, but it's not going to kill us. We're going through a scary transition. I don't dispute that, but it's not going to kill us because we need both.
Wes, you just brought up the market economy as a context in which architecture operates. And to me, it reminds me, and we always do need to be reminded, that there's also a political economy that architecture operates in. And this suggests, one of the things that this suggests for me is the kind of new salience of the humanities in a world in which human rights politics are developing in a new way. There's a new sort of focus on humanitarianism and global politics. The human itself has been subject to all kinds of kind of biopolitical investigation. And with that kind of reinvigoration of the humanities, I was really surprised when you wanted to dump art history in this new school of art and architecture and design. I thought where you would be going was, it would be really great to put architectural history as a department alongside art history and screen arts in the humanities. And so I guess that's my question for you as the dean. And so the question for Eve would be: would you feel happy with the Department of Architectural History, or that would you feel like you would lose something vital? And I guess for Wes and George, would you be sad to see the historians leave?
So let me just say that I violated a cardinal rule of being a dean, which is to think out loud. It was really
With
just
cameras present.
with cameras present. It was really just a passing thought. I actually don't feel confident drawing sharp disciplinary boundaries like that. What's happened, from my perspective, what we're dealing with is also a combination of traditionally liberal arts departments and professional schools. And this is a different dynamic, because clearly there's a part to art and design schools as well as architecture programs that really has nothing to do with broad-based inquiry for its own sake. It's far more practically focused. Art history, on the other hand, has also had to try to reinvent itself as a discipline, because I think they have found themselves very much like classics in a way, to be a kind of connoisseurship. I mean, regarded in a way as a kind of discipline for connoisseurs, and have struggled. Now, here's what I really worry about. I worry about, in the humanities, particularly over the last several years, quite frankly, a real downturn, a downshift in the number of jobs available for PhD students, a slowing, if not plateauing of undergraduate interest in the humanities, except when allied with some other disciplines. And so I actually maybe don't share your optimism about the reinvigoration of the humanities. I think it's possible. I just don't think it's actually underway yet. So I'm very much open to...
Let's get it on.
Yeah, let's get it on. Let's get it on. I mean, I'm very much open to that. Frankly, I think maybe we do need to do a little bit more intermixing. We need architectural historians in art history departments, and we need to send our art history and just our typical undergrads even into some of our professional school classes. But there are some limitations, namely that some of the professional schools tend to be smaller, tend not to have as many undergraduate courses. So the last thing I want to say was that I was calling for more undergraduate courses that actually introduce students to the discipline without necessarily implying a commitment that this is going to be their profession, but just professional schools offering more of these courses. And I think that intermixture is where we're going to continue to see, hopefully, some productive light rather than just heat.
I want to repeat an old plea of Jorge Silvetti for, the crossover character, the design teacher who's interested in history and knows a lot about it. And for, well, how about Jorge Silvetti as a case in point, though he didn't nominate himself, of course. He had Colin Rowe in mind as his role model. But we could talk about Mineo, Silvetti, that guy right there is another one of them. Robert Levitt in my school, Jorge first kind of characterized for me as another of those kinds of teachers. I guess I fall into this category myself. And I think Tim Hyde does. I think Pierre Vittorio does. I think Anna Miliaki does. I hope I'm not leaving anybody out inadvertently. I mean, I see Lucia, like there's a historian, all right. So I want them too, but I mean it's kind of they're not quite as deeply in the mud of the trenches of the studio as us kind of crossover types. But I do actually think architectural, and that's why I've been kind of worried. I was interested that Lucia, one of the other things Lucia said that really interested me was her kind of upbeat stance about the kind of PhD-icization of architectural education, which has been a worry to me because I'm certainly aware of it kind of causing a kind of troubling bifurcation between the kind of design-oriented faculty and the scholarly-oriented faculty and significant number of architecture schools. I'm not saying every one. But maybe, I mean, Lucia's commentary made me think, and as do the kind of characteristics of the careers of the three I mentioned, make me think maybe that fear of mine and of some others is overblown and that it will actually be transcended by a new generation of teachers who are more dexterous than the older generation was. It's certainly within the realm of possibility.
Yeah. Eve, do you want to speak about that?
Well, actually, yeah, I would say that our graduates, the people who get PhDs, many of whom are here, all teach studio and history theory. But actually, I think that most of them teach primarily studio at an early stage in their career. So that, you know, their teaching is informed by their scholarship, presumably. I mean, and it is, actually. So that crossover is happening. You just have people who have architecture degrees and PhDs. And so there's a kind of depth to that, which I think is a very, very positive thing. And this is a new generation. This is that generation that you're talking about. And I would say, as for myself, you know, whether I want to be in an art history department or in a humanities faculty, I really find it very important being connected to practice. And I think that one of the reasons that I find that very important is that one of my primary interests and concerns is with the city and with urbanism, and that the practice of architecture and the issues of the city are very, are contemporary and are totally multidisciplinary, and that being connected to practice and having history, and I mean, it's not only history that is involved in thinking about the city, so that it's perhaps the best place to be for that kind of study.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yep. We just have a couple of minutes left, so I'd like to ask the panelists if they have questions that they'd like to ask them. So, Monica has. Okay.
Derek, you made a really compelling argument for the model that we have here in Michigan for the undergraduate in architecture, which we all agree with you very strongly. And George, you gave an interesting model for how we may teach history of architecture, either in the undergraduate or in the graduate. I'm curious to hear the other three panelists, if they have a specific proposals. I know that it's not kosher in conferences to ask for specifics, and we're certainly not asking for a roadmap. But for me, it'll be interesting to conclude the speculation about the future with some sort of specific examples of how we may actually revisit architectural history or history as a whole in relationship to the discipline of architecture, or even in relationship to the discipline of planning, given the fact that we have architecture and planning both at the school.
Well, I mean, you know, planning is in such trouble. It's nobody really knows what it is anymore, and I don't think it's even taught really. Physical planning, that is, and it's moved so far away from the liberal arts. It's become a kind of professional degree. I suppose there are students who are getting PhDs somewhere in city planning. I heard some great ones at Berkeley a few weeks ago, but they were only city planning. They sort of crossed over into that territory.
So Robert Fishman and I will give you a little
okay.
of our masters of urban planning tonight.
Right. Well, I'm glad to hear that it's still alive at Michigan, because a lot of the schools I go to, it's not alive anymore.
We have a strong physical planning and getting stronger.
Yeah. Well, I'll be curious just to see what that is. I don't even know what that is anymore, I have to say.
That's the question I sort of was least looking forward to, but the one that is probably fairest given the nature of the conference. I just say that my probably too quickly illustrated notion of game, of the spirit of the game in the architecture studio is something that if I were made a dean or had that kind of power, I would seriously investigate. And again, I have no theory to back this and no real research either, but I would seriously investigate the possibility of trying to import that mindset into the teaching, I guess I'm not really supposed to use that term, into the architectural studio experience at an early stage, so that even those very beginning architectural problems are approached in a more game-like manner. And if that spirit was to invest the pedagogy on a broader level, then I think that history would take a place in that, along with the typical issues, structures even software skills, which are now replacing hand drawing skills, representational skills, and that sort of thing. And again, without having thought about it enough to actually describe a program, it seems to me that as a spirit of engagement of the issues on a broader base, I think that would give us a way into a lot of to resolving some of the dilemmas or that we feel with regards to this. Because I mean, it's not a problem for anybody here. Probably is engaged enough and interested enough in history as an issue. It's a fascinating subject, whether you instrumentalize it or not. For most of the people here, I mean, I have to say I was fascinated by the references to sci-fi, science fiction, which is a huge interest of mine, and I would have been much happier talking about the notion of the passage of time in relation to history, in relation to science fiction, and how the science fiction mindset, which is like the game playing mindset, can be a very interesting way to tackle subjects in studio. And in fact, I've done a few studios in that way because it liberates the students. It takes them out of the sort of fusty academic framework of learning and turns it into a much more creative, participatory kind of thing. And to the extent that we give them permission to, say, misread history, something that we should feel quite freely to do since Derrida has opened the door to that for us, for example. If we give them the permission to do that, which is not to say that the actual professional historian's role is to be discounted. In fact, maybe it becomes even more of a game because then we have the games that are invented by the students pitted against the reality factor of the of the professional historians. You know, there's the possibility for all of the kind of competitive aspects of it, the intrigue, the imagination, the desire, all of that to happen in a way that we now see on occasion in studio itself. But history, slide ideas, et cetera, et cetera. I have to say I just started teaching a quasi-history course in the last few years, and in order to prepare for that, I had to relearn all the stuff that I had learned, as a student, and really not just sort of wanted to get through. But coming back to it again after having practiced for 20-odd years, it was immensely more fun. I could totally see where stuff was coming from, and it really gave myself the sense of what I was doing is fitting into a longer tradition, gave it way more meaning. It was much less about being, original and novel and innovative and everything, so much as adding, and again, this may be the sci-fi part of my brain working too, but adding incrementally to the evolution of the species and the works of the species and that sort of thing. So, just capturing that spirit, I think, would be the way to bring history alive again for us.
Well, I would say that, and this is something that we are talking about all the time at the GSD, is to figure out ways of integrating history and more with studio, and having, certainly in the core, when certain issues are being dealt with, to have a kind of historical perspective. But I think that one of the places where it really can happen is in the thesis, which we have. And one of the things that we've discovered in thesis is that students will do a semester's worth of thesis prep, which is research, and then the next semester they're supposed to come up with a thesis, which is a design project. They have no idea about how to combine these two. And I think that that's where history, which is, after all, I mean, that's what I'm talking about with research, that it's a way of historical thinking that you combine with design thinking, and that it informs the way in which you think about architecture. And so through research and research methods and what you learn about architecture, history, and so on, can actually inform you as a designer, not in a literal borrowing way, but as a way of thinking. And so I do believe through research.
It's just occurred to me, there's been so much, I haven't heard a really rigorous attack on operative history in the day and a half we've been here, and given that our panel has tended to focus on the kind of benefits to the design curriculum of operative uses of history in relation to studio, I just and we've got a bunch of real architectural historians in the room. Here Vittorio quoted my heroine, Hannah Arendt. There's one, when she was writing in the 50s, the height of the Cold War, Stalinism, she made this she could be wonderfully sarcastic. Consider, for example, she said, the role in the Russian Revolution of a man by the name of Trotsky. Suppressed. I've been unable to track this down since I read her such a long time ago. There is no such thing as objectivity, but there is such a thing as objective intent. So I actually think, if those students in the design studio get the tiniest little curiosity about that larger territory of history, I think it's very important that the historians, the real, rigorous scholarly historians, continue working away at figuring out, what actually happened and what was its import. It's not necessarily going to turn on the students in the studio this particular Wednesday, but it's profoundly important for the future of our academic discipline.
I would just say one thing, George, that history is not only about what happened. It's about how to it's how to think, how to understand what happened.
Oh, I
and
don't
how
disagree with
to
that,
understand. It's about change, and it's as much about the future as it is about the past. So that
I'm only arguing against its always being operationalized. That's all. That's all.
Can I just add one little comment in favor of fustiness against something I said just a minute ago, which is to say that one of the trends in undergraduate education, and you can see this in the design studio work, is toward project-based, team-based learning. This is swept over the natural sciences. It's sweeping the social sciences. The humanities is, I think, a bastion of a different kind of methodology. You can't compartmentalize humanities problems or anatomize humanities problems in such a way all the time that you can then create a team of undergraduates to go out and solve them. There is a kind of work that the historian does, archivally based, rigorously examining the history, the material culture, and then making judgments, decisions about how to reconstruct that past, as you've said, not just for the past, but in fact for the future. That's a different kind of learning. And so I applaud both. I'm not saying that your approach to gaming and the spirit of that is in any sense wrong, but it certainly can't supersede every other kind of methodological training.
And not to say that the most rigorous academics themselves don't engage in that within their own little rivalries and stuff. Certainly there is coolness within art and architectural history. People recognize a cool paper and they recognize a clever paper and a truly clever insight versus just filling in the holes and that sort of thing. So it's not to say that it doesn't have a place there. I was kind of implying more, just trying to capture not the grad students who may have already kind of decided they're going that way and interested in it, but the younger.
Well, this is a conversation that I think and hope has a future at other tables and other places. I thank the panelists for their work at this table.